Mesdames et messieurs, avec Boris Bruckler, notre talentueux modérateur, je vous prie de réserver un triomphe à Georges R.R. Martin.
Great to see you all here. Thank you. Since I only speak English, we'll be mostly doing this in English.
Yes, absolutely.
But I hope some of you who do not speak English have the earphones, the translations.
Alors, merci à tous et à toutes d'être ici. Merci de ne pas prendre de photos avec flash. George R.R. Martin, thank you to be here with us today.
Well, my pleasure.
It's crowded, as you can see.
It is. Everyone trying to get out of the weather.
Yes. At the end of this masterclass, we will have a few minutes, about a quarter or 20 minutes for the question. So, George, my first question is about your work method. There seems to be many historical references in your work. In Song of Ice and Fire, of course, but also in your other writings like A Fever Dream or perhaps also Armageddon Rag. Do you do historical research when you're writing?
Yes, certainly. When I'm writing something with a historical setting, usually even before I started, I try to immerse myself in the period. Fever Dream is a good example. That book is set in the American antebellum South on the Mississippi River, the era of the great steamboats. And I first got the idea for that when I was living in Dubuque, Iowa, and teaching college in the late 70s. Dubuque is an old river town. Used to be a center for steamboat traffic on the upper river, a place where steamboats were manufactured. There was a lot of history there. And I heard a little of the history, and it got me interested. I went to the library and I got more books about the history of steamboating, first in Dubuque and then on the upper river and then on the river as a whole. Sent me back to Mark Twain. I reread some of those. At some point in there, I decided to do the novel, but I didn't immediately start the novel. I collected books about the period. I collected books about steamboating and read them one by one over the years. Because when I actually am writing, I hate anything that interrupts me, whether it's a phone call or someone knocking on my door or having to stop and look up a fact. So I want to know as much as possible about a period before I actually sit down to write, because the last thing I want to do is, okay, what kind of underwear were they wearing right then? Let me stop and look at my book about underwear. That breaks my momentum, and most than anything, I hate to break my momentum. So I try to learn as much as I can beforehand, and that certainly applied to Fever Dream. I think I probably read books about steamboating for 2 years before I wrote the first word in that novel. And I didn't actually write it until I'd actually left the Mississippi and was living down in the desert southwest. So it doesn't always necessarily apply to what's outside the window.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot of details, indeed, in Fever Dream, especially about the steamboats.
Right.
There is a lot of description of the saloon inside of the steamboat, of the way to live on the boat. So
Well, it's, helps the period come alive. My goal as a writer is always to immerse my readers in the scenes that they're writing about, to make them feel almost as if they were living those scenes rather than just reading about them. So I tend to, the old writer's maxim, show, don't tell. I want to show, I want to put my reader in there. I want them to taste the food and see the sights the protagonist is seeing and hear the words that they're doing. And I can't say I always succeed in that, but that's certainly my goal in the vast majority of things that I write.
In the Song of Ice and Fire, there is a lot of characters, a lot of places. There is even a whole history of Westeros. How do you manage that? Do you create lists? Do you do a mind map? How do you manage it?
You know, I get asked this question a lot, and I really don't have a good answer for it. I just do. I remember this stuff. I'm aided by the fact that while writing Ice and Fire, which I began in 1991, I was writing on a computer. I don't think I could have ever have done in the early part of my career in the 70s and early 80s when I was still using a typewriter. It would have been a lot harder, but computers have search and replace functions. So I can always, if I'm writing about a character that hasn't appeared for 3 books, I can just hit the search button and find every previous occurrence of that character and refresh myself. It certainly beats leafing through hundreds of pages of books trying to say, what the hell color eyes did I give this guy? I still make mistakes with the eye color. I've made a few mistakes with eye color, and once there was a horse that changed sex. In books. My readers point this out to me, and my readers are very cognizant of this. Some of them are cognizant to the point of being obsessive, and they know all these details. And the truth is, in many ways, I have a terrible memory. I mean, I've met a lot of very nice people here in Neuchâtel at NIFFF, and sad to say, if I met you yesterday, I've probably already forgotten you today. It's like the brain synapses that other people use for remembering real people, I seem to use for remembering people that I made up. So maybe that's a sign of mental illness or something, or a way a writer works, but it certainly does seem to be the way I work. I would actually like it when I do a lot of science fiction conventions, and when you go to those, people have big name tags, you know. Not like, we have name tags here, but they're little things and they hang down and they always turn in the wrong direction. So you're just looking at a blank thing. But the big name tags in science fiction conventions are very useful to me, actually. Oh, hello, Fred, nice to see you again. If everybody in life wore name tags, I would be better off. But my characters at least wear name tags in the computers.
Thank you. You studied journalism. You worked for Hollywood as a screenwriter. How did this influence your work, your writings?
Well, you know, that's 2 different questions. Yes, journalism was my major at college a million years ago, believe it or not. Once I was indeed a college student. I've been writing short stories, comic book stories and little science fiction stories and monster stories since I was a little kid, since I was like 10 years old. And in high school I wrote for comic book fanzines, stories of fictional superheroes. I think taking journalism in college had a great effect on me in improving my prose, because my very early writings was very ornate, very florid, very purple. You know, I seem to think that if one adjective was good, 3 was better. Journalism produced a leaner style, which I think benefited me somewhat. So there was a stylistic benefit to that journalism education. The other effect that journalism had on me is more difficult to gauge, but was probably more profound in that it helped me overcome. I was a very shy kid. I mean, I had friends and all that, but I was, you know, what today we would call a geek or a nerd, but those are compliments now. Those weren't compliments back then. It was, no one wanted to be called a geek or a nerd or anything. And I was the guy who read comic books, and I went home after school and I read my comic books and I played games to myself and I read books. And I didn't interact a whole lot with other kids. I was very shy. Journalism forced me to get out of it, because as studying to be a reporter for classes, they would say, you know, go here and interview this guy, or go there and interview that guy, or we want you to cover this story, and you have to speak to 7 different people about it. 7 different people I didn't know, but now I had an excuse to go up and speak to them. I was thrown in all sorts of environments that were uncomfortable to me, you know, sports locker rooms and demonstrations. I mean, it was the late 60s. There were a lot of demonstrations. We had a demonstration every day, you know. Here was a demonstration, here was the counter demonstration. Some of them got violent. But it was exciting too, and you know, I had my press. It was student press. It was like student press, but it wasn't real. But still, I was present at all of these things as a reporter, and it really opened me up. It really got me used to going out there and experiencing the world and just talking to people, and changed me, I think, profoundly. So journalism was very good for me in that sense, even though after graduation, I don't think I ever practiced it very much. Hollywood, well, now you're talking 20 years later in a whole different game.
It's a different game.
Yeah.
As a screenwriter.
As a screenwriter, you know, when you're writing books, it's just you. It's you and the typewriter and the blank sheet of paper in the early days, and then you and the computer and the blinking cursor in the later days. And there's nobody else around. And there are good things about that, but there are also bad things about that. You are isolated. When you're working in Hollywood, you're working with other people. You're part of a team. It's a collaboration. You're going there every day and you're working with 3 or 4 other writers, and you're having to deal with the network and with the studio and with the actors and the director, and the special effects guy is coming in, and you know, the prop guy saying, which of these guns do you like? And the costume guy saying, well, here's my sketches for the costume, what do you think of it? And you're working with all these very creative people, and it can drive you crazy sometimes, but it can also be a very enriching and exciting experience, because you get to experience other people's creativity too.
Yes, thank you. You are a professional for many years now, a successful professional. What qualities are needed, according to you, to be a good fantasy writer? It's a hard question.
What qualities are needed to be a good fantasy writer? Well, I think it helps to love fantasy and to have a knowledge of the field. But the main part is just to be a good writer.
It's the same thing to write a comic book and fantasy books?
Comic book is a different form, but you know, ultimately it all comes down to story. There are people in my field, and of course I've been mostly working in science fiction and fantasy since I first began to publish, and horror to an extent. There are writers who will tell you that these are 3 completely different fields, that science fiction is here and fantasy is over here, and they're polar opposites and never the twain shall meet. And I don't know where they put horror, somewhere down here or something, but I've never recognized that difference. You know, when I was a kid, reading voraciously, I read Robert A. Heinlein, I read H.P. Lovecraft, I read Robert E. Howard, and then later J.R. Tolkien, and some of these would be classified fantasy, and some as horror, and some as science fiction. To me, they were all stories. They were imaginative stories. They were stories that took me to other worlds and other times and other planets or dimensions or what have you. And I enjoyed the hell out of them. I didn't see these as totally different things, and I still don't. I think these distinctions are largely false ones. These are questions of furnishings. And I've moved from one to another freely throughout my career. I may be one of the writers of the last generation to be able to do that. At least in the United States. I have to keep remembering that I'm not here in the United States, I'm in Switzerland, and the rules may be very different here. But American publishing has become very rigid in recent decades. And I know writers, younger writers than myself, who are writing science fiction and are writing fantasy, and their publisher says, oh, you cannot write both of these, you must have 2 different names. You can write science fiction as Bill Jones, but then you must be Fred Smith when you're writing fantasy, because otherwise you will confuse the readers. I actually happen to think readers are smarter than that, and they can handle the fact that the same writer writes different, different things under the same name. Certainly readers of past generations had no difficulty doing that. Robert A. Heinlein wrote fantasy. H.P. Lovecraft wrote science fiction. These are all just made-up stories. So the main thing to be a good writer, I think, is you have to have talent. You have to have skill with words that seems fairly obvious, but not everyone has it. A good ear for prose. In particular, if you're going to write something like comic books or television and film, where so much of it rests on dialogue, you have to have a good ear for dialogue and the way people actually speak, and the individuality to give each character his own method of speaking. You know, so I sometimes teach writing classes, and there are various exercises you can give to students, and one of them is to describe a half dozen different characters, and then write a speech for each of these characters without a name tag. Just say, okay, here's a priest, and here's a soldier, and here's a housewife, and here's a prostitute, and here's you know, invent whatever you want. Write a speech for each of them in which they don't refer to their expression, they don't give their name, but just make each speech sound different from the other, so you could instantly know, just from the words, this is the priest speaking, this is the prostitute speaking. And that kind of, the talent to do that, if they all sound the same, you have a problem. They should sound different. Another thing is the empathy, an interest in human beings. I mean, character is the heart of all stories. I don't care if you're writing science fiction, fantasy, horror, or mainstream story, literary fiction, mystery novel, historical fiction. It's all about the people who inhabit it. It's all about the characters. And there will be many different kinds of characters. And you should be able to have a certain amount of empathy for them. And that's certainly one thing that I've tried very hard to make part of my fiction. Even if you're writing from the viewpoint of someone who's not at all heroic, who's a villain perhaps, or would be considered a villain, he has his motivations, he has his reasons, he doesn't necessarily think he's the villain. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I am the villain, what evil things can I do today? You know, except possibly the Red Skull, or, you know, in Marvel Comics, but even the better Marvel villains don't do that. Dr. Doom had his own reasons for doing what he did. Dr. Doom thought he was well justified, but...
Thank you. You were speaking about hero. I've noticed that none of your characters, apart perhaps a few exceptions, are super beings or superhero. In that way, that makes you almost an opposite of Frank Herbert's Dune, or many novels of Jack Vance, or even Tolkien, of course. Why that? Don't you like heroes? Even if one of your first professional works was a short story called A Hero?
Yes, and you know what happened to the hero that I want.
Yes, I know.
I've been killing people since my earliest stories.
Yes.
You know, I grew up on comic books where we have the superhero. The whole concept of the superhero. The superhero is like a professional hero, you know, with superpowers. He puts on a spandex costume and he goes out in the streets to do heroic shit. I also edit this series called Wildcards, which some of you may know. We've been doing it since 1987. There was one guy who liked it there. It's been very popular. It's about to start being published in France, so I'm excited about that. It was published in Germany, and we're about to resume it in Germany. So, and it's already being published in Italy, so it's very, very popular. And it's I got like 40 writers writing for it, and it's a consideration of the whole comic book idea of superpowers. What would happen if some portion of the people in the world got actual superpowers, being super strong, or being able to fly, or throw lightning bolts from their fingers? What would they do? And the answer from some of the best science fiction minds of our generation is not buy a spandex costume and fight bank robbers. You know, if you're like an accountant and one day you wake up and you're the strongest man in the world and you can lift tanks overhead and break through, you must have become a really strong accountant. People tend to stay with what they want, and the world would create a celebrity and all that, but there's a long-winded way of saying people do heroic things. But very few people are actually heroes, where I get up every morning and I'm going to do a heroic deed today. I'm going to go out and rescue someone. We think of certain professions as heroic, a cop, a firefighter, and these guys are guys who are called on and can be called on any time to do something heroic. But they don't do something heroic every day. In fact, many policemen go through their entire lives, they're 40 years on the force writing traffic tickets, and they never draw their gun or solve a murder or save anyone from harm. So I'm not interested in heroes because I really don't think heroes per se exist in the way that most fiction sometimes depicts them. But I am interested in heroism. And I think in an audience like this, all of you have the potential to be heroes, like on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, you may be shits. Because that's the way real human beings are. We all have the capacity to do great good inside us. We all have the capacity to be selfish or greedy or petty. We've all done things, I hope, that we're proud of. And if we can admit it to ourselves, we've all done things that we're ashamed of. I know I certainly have done both. And that's the kind of human being that interests me. I mean, boy, what amazing, fascinating creatures human beings are, with all these contradictions inside ourselves. That's the sort of characters I want to explore. Not the guy who's just, I am Joe Hero, or his alternate, I'm the Dark Lord. I'm here to bring darkness over the earth. What a job description.
Could Haviland Tuff, the main character of the novel Tough World Voyaging, could he be a model of hero or some kind of hero for you?
No. Haviland Tuff hopefully is a fascinating character, but I wouldn't call him a hero. He's a businessman. He's in and he tries to do his best and help people, but he can get very petty and annoyed with people too. And he's been known to, wreck entire cultures and ecologies just because someone annoys him. Something I'm sure we'd all like to have the power of.
Thank you. Now, if you agree, I would like to continue by giving you some key words, and I would like to hear your reaction regarding your own writing, if you agree.
Okay.
Please don't say no. Loss, disillusion, nostalgia. There is a lot of disillusion in your writings. For example, with some characters like Sansa Stark or Sandy Blair, the main character of Armageddon Rag. There is also a lot of nostalgia. For example, the Captain Marsh in your novel Fever Dream. Are these subjects important for you?
Yes, I think they are. I think there's something deeply ingrained in my personality. I think this is something, when we're kids, when we're young, we're shaped by the environment that we grow up in, and I think sometimes, even before we're conscious of it, certain ideas take very, very deep roots in my head. I gave a whole speech about this once, which some of you can read. It's online, the speech I gave at the 2003 Toronto World Science Fiction Convention about my childhood. But I grew up poor in Bayonne, New Jersey. We lived, from the age of 4, I lived in a low-income housing projects in Bayonne, which is a peninsula right across from a dock, which was called City Dock. And the project that I lived at was called Latreille Gardens. And there was the dock was on a body of water called the Kilvan Cull, a deep water channel that connected New York Bay with Newark Bay, where heavy ships would go past it at all, day and night, ships from all over the world. I used to watch them and watch the flags and dream of traveling to those distant countries. Not too many had Swiss flags that I recall. I gather you guys don't have a big navy. I don't know.
We have a big navy.
Oh, do you?
Yes.
Who knew? But what was interesting about this is I discovered as I grew up that on my mother's side, my mother was Irish, was a Brady, and the Bradys at one time had been a very prominent family in Bayonne. And they had built that dock that was across the street that we called City Dock. In fact, it had been called Brady's Dock for generations because it had been built by my great-great-great-grandfather because he owned a big construction company and he built a lot of Bayonne. And he brought in his own construction materials to that dock. And, you know, he had a big house on between 3rd and 4th Street. My school was on 5th Street. So I would walk right up Lord Avenue, which is an interesting name too. I think Lord Avenue, Lords, so I'm writing them all about Lords. These things set their things. Now we didn't live in that house because our family had lost all the money during the Depression. The family had started warring with each other, one Brady against another Brady. When the patriarch died, the children started, and our branch of the family had lost all the money, and then the company had went bankrupt anyway, and the dock had been taken over by the city for back taxes, and the big house on between 3rd and 4th Street had been sold. Latourette Gardens, where I lived, this little housing project, I learned, had once been the site of the Latourette Hotel, this gigantic Victorian hotel with, unlike some of the hotels that you have here in Neuchâtel, but built in the mid-1800s in Bayonne, which lasted until the early 1920s. And at one point had been this golden sort of Great Gatsby resort where rich people from New York had come to play and had stayed at the Latourette Hotel and had played croquet on the lawn and ridden their horses because there were stables connected with it, and had gone swimming in the crystal clear waters of the Kilvan Cove. Well, by the time I came along, the crystal clear waters were incredibly polluted, and if you went into Kilvan Cove, you risked, you know, getting leprosy or something like that, or your limbs growing off. Nobody's sane. The rocks were all covered with oil slicks from the oil refineries nearby. You couldn't go in the water. Of course, the old hotel had been knocked down, and now this low-income project had been there. The dock was no longer belonging to our family. It was a city dock, and it was like I always felt compelled to tell people that used to be our dock. And then I would walk past, every day going to school, living in a low-income project, I had to walk past the house that my mother had been born in, and that her grandfather and great-grandfather before had built, in fact. And now other people live there. I never went inside that dock. And I think all of this gave me this, I don't know, this attraction to lost golden ages. You know, I had a little bit of Daenerys Targaryen there thinking about the Seven Kingdoms as I walked. This all was once mine, or I would have been the heir to this dock and this house, and now I'm dispossessed of all of them. Where are my dragons to take back my house, my dock? But I had no dragons, but sad to say. I don't know, so I look back on it and I think these very factors of my childhood, these stories I was told of how our family had once been great and powerful and important, and now we were just more poor people, gave me this attraction to that. But it's been an attraction that's been with me my whole life, and you can see it in Abner Marsh, you can see it in Armageddon Rag, you can see the people always looking backward to a golden age, real or imagined. And some golden ages were real. I mean, we tend to disparage this as nostalgia and think that everybody looks back to a past, and the past wasn't necessarily that great. But in some epochs of you know, human history, the past was better than the present. I mean, you think back to ancient Rome and the people who were living, you know, under warring emperors, looking back to the good old days of Augustus. Well, the good old days of Augustus were pretty good compared to what followed Augustus with Tiberius and Caligula and Nero and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you. So the next keyword, impossible love. For example, it's the main subject of your short story, A Song for Lyra. It's also one of the main subjects of your novel, The Dying of Light. It's hard to love in your novels.
Right.
Why?
It's hard to love in life. Have you noticed?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's part of me, and certainly this was very true of me in the early 20s. If you read the stories that I published in the first decade of my career, that my stuff in the 1970s is immensely romantic, in both senses of the word. I mean, it's the romance of distant places and distant planets, and all very colorful and exotic and very Jack Vancian kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Vance for a long time has been my favorite science fiction and fantasy writer. But it's also romantic in the sense of, you know, boy, girl, and finding true love, and all of that. Some of this is obviously a yearning in myself when I was young, looking for, as many people do in their teens and 20s, looking for that one person, looking for the true love, the impossibility of finding it, the whole existential loneliness there. Even when we're with someone, sometimes we're not with someone because we're all separate from each other. We don't have telepathy like Maya does. We can't psychically bond with someone. We have these crude instruments of words to try to express our feelings and get things across, and worried about we're going to say the wrong thing, we're going to lose the very thing that we most desire, and you know, it's all difficult. And then there's sex, which makes it even 1,000 times more difficult. So all of that was material to be explored, and I did try to explore it in a number of stories, of which A Song for Laya was probably the most successful, but there was also things like A Second Kind of Loneliness, and This Tower of Ashes, and For a Single Yesterday, and The Lonely Songs of Larendor, and In the Lost Lands, and on and on and on. It was a subject that I spent a lot of time exploring and grappling with.
It's still a subject now, with some characters of Songs of Ice and Fire.
To an extent, yes. But there's a lot of other things going on in Song of Ice and Fire, too. You may have noticed.
So, another subject, part one. Women. There is a lot of strong women in your novels. Strong women.
Strong women,
yes. Are you a feminist writer, do you think?
You know, this is a question I've been asked before. I keep giving a different answer to it every time. Basically I believe that women are people. And I was very much, in the 70s, I would have said instantly, yes, I'm a feminist writer, even though I'm a male. But I do recognize that I'm a male. And there's been a lot of waves of feminism. I don't want to, I'm hardly an expert on any of this stuff, so I'm sure there are women in the audience, and perhaps even some men in the audience, who know far more about this stuff than I do. But there have been changes in the feminist movement since the 70s to the present. And I've had some women in the subsequent years tell me I can't be a feminist because I shouldn't use that term for myself because I'm a male. That only women can be true feminists and men can just be allies. And, well, okay, I'm not going to dictate anyone else's terminology to them. I certainly don't want to offend anyone by calling myself a feminist. If that's an offensive thing for a man to do, I don't know, you know. But I believe there are differences between men and women. But I think the differences between men and women are very small compared to the similarities between men and women. You know, our common humanity gives us far more things that we share than the things that divide us, and I try to reflect that in my fiction. And both men and women have a great variety of individual personalities. So, like I've sometimes asked, well, how do you write women? I don't write women. I don't sit down and say, now I am going to write a woman. It's like, okay, now I'm going to write a chapter about Brienne. What would Brienne think about this? I'm going to write a chapter about Arya. I'm going to write a chapter about Cersei. They're very different from each other. The way that Cersei reacts to something is very different from the way Brienne is going to react to something. They have different worldviews. They have different beliefs. They have different upbringings that have shaped them in fundamentally different ways. You know, the fact that they have certain genitalia in common, it should not be the dictating thing into how one writes them. So that's what I try to do. I try to write individuals, and some of them are male, and some of them are female, and in some of my other stories, some of them are, you know, vampires or werewolves or creatures from other planets, but I'm always trying to write individuals. But I do think in a book as big as A Song of Ice and Fire, where I have thousands of characters, I'm creating a whole world. Worlds have many different types of people in it, and it has male and female about equal parts. It also has various ethnic groups, various religious groups, various sexual preferences, and I try to reflect all of that. Sometimes perhaps more successfully than other times.
Oh, you are successful. Next subject, war and violence. Of course, there is a lot of violence in the book, especially in A Song of Ice and Fire, but you treated it very seriously. It's never for fun. Is there a relationship with your life during the Vietnam War? The way you treat violence and war?
Well, you know, war has been a central part of fantasy since Tolkien and even before. I mean, you go kind of all the way back to the Iliad, and you know, you've got a fantasy classic set around the Trojan War. So I think it's certainly a legitimate subject to write about. But I do think it is a subject that's of great importance, maybe the most important thing of all. And it should not be treated, I don't know, for fun. Because it's not, I don't know, to me at least it's not funny. Yeah, you can get humor out of everything. I don't want to, let me rephrase that. You can do funny things about war, sure. People have done and will do. And you can find black humor in anything, and that's good too. I appreciate black humor. But for me, I worked in network television for American network television for 10 years back in the 80s and 90s. And being a broadcast station, we were subject to network standards and practices, that is censorship. And they tried to keep out all sex was one of the things. And the other thing is they always tried to tone down the violence. In fact, they probably would have said, well, we don't want any violence in our show. But we do want lots of action. And action is, what is action? The network might give you a different definition, but to my mind, action is bloodless violence. You know, you see action, an action film, you know, here's an exciting car chase and all the cars are slamming against each other and they're flipping over and they're going into the ditch and the flames are engulfing the cars that have crashed. You never actually see the twisted bodies. You never see the person who, when the car slammed into each other, their leg was severed and they're bleeding to death in the front of that car. You never see the drivers inside the car that's just blown up, screaming in agony as the flesh consumes them. That's the side of action the network doesn't want to show you because it might disturb you. Well, sorry, I think you should be disturbed. My position on this is really kind of articulated over the last decades since I did this, and I'm against action. I mean, you can do a straight character piece with no deaths in it and no one being in jeopardy and all that, and that's fine. You know, you can write My Dinner with Andre or a Woody Allen comedy and all that, but if you're going to do something where people are dying, if you're going to do a war story especially, then show war the way it is. And the way it is complicated. Because the truth is, we like war. Why is there this aptitude for action? Because like Achilles, who had the choice between a short and glorious life or a long and boring one, he chose the short and glorious life, and he wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, and indeed he did. The ancients always talked about the glories of war, and you can still see some of that in the pageantry of the Middle Ages, which I reflect in Game of Thrones, and the knights with their armor shining in the sun, the banners. In a world that was largely brown and mud-colored, here were these incredible warriors with their heraldry, with their eagles and their lions and their wolves flying from the banners. It has a beauty to it, a frightening beauty. But when those armies clash, then you get the severed limbs and you get the lakes of blood and you get all of that. And I think if you're going to honestly treat with that material, show both sides. And that's what I try to do. Show the glory, but also show the pain and the grief and the cost of the glory, the price of war. I'm not a pacifist, but I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, because I thought that particular war was immoral and illegal. In fact, as most wars by America have been illegal over the last, well, pretty much my lifetime. They would always ask you when you applied, you know, you had to have an interview and you had to answer questions when you applied for conscientious objector status. And there were some draft boards in the United States that only wanted to grant it to total pacifists, people who at least would claim, well, I would never fight under any circumstances, I would never take a human life. I certainly don't claim that for myself. I never have taken a human life, but I think under right circumstances I could. And they always say, well, what would you do if, you know, Adolf Hitler was raping your grandmother? Well, you know, yeah, I would kill Adolf Hitler if he was raping my grandmother. I might kill him just for being Adolf Hitler. But, you know, it was always, well, would you fight in World War II? Yeah, most of us would fight in World War II. But World War II wasn't the war on the menu at the present time. And one of the things I decided then, grappling with these issues, was that Ho Chi Minh was not Adolf Hitler, and in fact he was certainly not Sauron, which is the issue that much of us have to deal with as fantasy writers. It's all very easy to always write these books in which Sauron is always the villain, or Morgoth, even worse, or, you know, and you're fighting against the Dark Lord, or the Rotten One, or the bad guy, or, you know, Lord Malice, or whatever the hell you're going to call your big bad. But real life doesn't really offer us that, and I wanted to inject a certain level of realism into the kind of fiction I was writing.
Thank you very much. Now it's time, I think, to continue with the question of the audience. Nous allons continuer avec les questions du public. Alors merci d'attendre le micro, de lever la main lorsque vous avez une question et de bien parler dans le micro. Merci également de poser les questions en français. Do you have your translator right now? You don't have any translator?
I don't have.
Oh,
no, I don't have a translator.
So, okay, we don't have.
Do I need a translator?
Well, normally yes, but I could translate it for you if you want. Or the audience could ask the question in English. Yes? Do you have a translator? It's coming.
Okay. Translators are coming. So it is winter.
J'arrive, c'est le micro. Does it work? Est-ce que ça fonctionne?
I'm ready. Is someone here?
Ça fonctionne?
Hello, ground control to Major Tom.
1, 2, 1.
So I'm not hearing anyone at the other end
No.
here. Maybe I'm turning.
I'm afraid my French isn't good enough to ask it in French anyway, so. While your translator arranged himself. Hi, George. Thank you for
Hello.
everything. The Song of Ice and Fire and the Duncan Egg stories are the basics of my book rotation. I reread them regularly. So I was wondering, what was the last book that you reread and read over and over again?
I read Lord of the Rings every few years. Since I first read it at the age of 12 and 13, it's been one of my favorite books. It holds up to repeated rereadings. Every time I read it, I find something new. I read, another book that I frequently reread is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. We were talking about romance before. That was one of the most romantic books I've ever read. And I read it at a formative era when I was, you know, having my heart broken frequently and writing a lot of my most romantic science fiction. It's interesting to get back to this issue of romance that you raised earlier. When I was in Spain a few years ago, I had a dinner with a woman, a Spanish academic, and a big fan of both science fiction and romance. And she had read a lot of my stuff because people said I was a very romantic writer. And she sort of launched into me at dinner saying, What are you talking about? You're not a romantic writer. You know, nobody ever lives happily ever after in your books. And it's always, and I was defending, I was saying, whoa, but that's a different tradition of romance. I'm a romantic writer in a tradition of like a Great Gatsby and Romeo and Juliet and you know, Beauty and the, you know, these things don't necessarily have happy endings. Aren't the most powerful romances the unfulfilled romances, the romances where people go their separate ways, but they'll always have Paris, right? Like Casablanca, one of the films I showed here. You know, they go separate at the end, but they'll always have Paris. And she basically said, "No, you're wrong. They have to be happily ever after together for it to be romance. Otherwise, it's just sad." So, so there was what. Anyway, digression. So, what else do we have here?
Est-ce qu'on peut passer le micro, ça va, avec la dame?
Hello.
Hello.
I wondered, regarding the series, how does it feel to see your world, your imagination coming to life?
Well, I was nervous at first because, you know, you turn your baby over to other people and you never know how they're going to treat it. But I turned my baby over to the best people I knew, to David Benioff and Dan Weiss, amazing pair of writers and showrunners who've done some very distinguished work separately, and to HBO, which was the best, the best production company in American television. They had elevated television to heights previously undreamed of with shows like The Sopranos and Deadwood. So I did the best I can, and I was handsomely rewarded. I've been very, very pleased with what I've seen.
Hi, I have a question about your writing process. Your books have a lot of characters that have a lot of potential, but they're only in the books for a really short time. I'm thinking of characters like Weasel or the small brown girl Nettles. So I was wondering, when you write characters like these, do you have like a backstory in mind? Do you know what happens to them in the future, or are they only in your head for the brief time that they're actually in books?
I usually always have a backstory in mind, even for the most minor character. Now, it might not be a really detailed backstory. You know, I'm not saying I could fill up a whole book with the backstory of Weasel, let us say. But I kind of know where she came from and how she got to where she was. I don't necessarily know what happened to her after she parts from our characters. That's another issue. If she comes back into the story, then I'll probably figure out what happened between then and now. You know, I mentioned Jack Vance earlier, a writer I have loved and admired for a long, long time. I did a tribute anthology to him, Songs of the Dying Earth, with 40 other writers doing stories in the tradition of Jack Vance. Vance had a gift of making every character in his book, even if they only appeared for a page, come to life as a person. You always felt that this was a real person who had his own way of looking. He didn't know that he was just a one-page walk-on. He thought the story was about him. And I've always tried to keep Vance's approach in mind when I'm doing my characters, you know, because that's the way the real life functions, you know. I mean, we're all individuals and we all see the world through our own eyes. For me, I'm experiencing this event here as me up on stage doing a Masterclass, and you know, you guys are experiencing it as well. This is the latest event I went to, and after this I get to have lunch or something like that. And some of you may be fascinated, some of you may be bored, I don't know. But we're all seeing it our own way, and I try to keep that in mind with the characters. That the spear carriers in a book don't know that they're spear carriers. They think it's their story. They're living the story of their life. So if you keep that in mind, and usually it just takes a touch of someone who doesn't just say the line that they need to say to further the plot, but they say some other line that reflects there's an actual human being there who has their own agenda as well as furthering the plot. That can be enough to bring them to life. At least that's what I try to do. And Vance was the one who kind of showed me how to do that.
Prochaine question, oui. Où se trouve le micro? Voilà, le monsieur là, qui lève bien haut la main, avec le t-shirt blanc. Non, alors plus loin. D'accord.
So, George, thank you for coming and for writing all these stories that we love. And I was wondering, what piece of advice do you wish somebody would have given you when you first started writing and publishing?
Well, I got a lot of good advice from the science fiction and fantasy writers who had gone before me. Science fiction and fantasy has been a community since the 30s when writers started getting together at conventions, and I think we're very lucky in that sense because we have this community with half a century or more of history. And the older writers have helped the younger writers in that and giving them advice. I got a lot of advice when I was first breaking in. There's Robert A. Heinlein, who once said, you can't possibly pay back the guys who helped you when you were breaking in, so you have to pay forward to the guys who come after you. And that you see a lot of that in science fiction and fantasy. So I got a lot of good advice in my day. Of course, the conditions change, the markets change, so the good advice that I got in 1971 really wouldn't help too much in this day and age. The markets are always changing, and we're living in a brave new world here with the internet and e-publishing and independent publishing and BitTorrents and systems of distribution breaking down and transitioning to a global marketplace. There's a lot of strange stuff going on. I think the basic advice to writers is the same as it's been for a long time, though, is you have to write. You have to write every day and write constantly. Write it and send it out, and you have to read. That's the other thing. Read voraciously. Don't just read fantasy, even if that's what you want to write. Read history, read historical fiction, read classics of literature, read everything, because it's never telling who has a good technique that you can use, or a good idea that you can steal, or something like that. Read all the time, and write all the time, and the rest is, in the hands of the gods. Marry someone rich, that's good too.
Autre question, oui? Là-haut, oui?
Hello. A more personal question and very simple one. What is your favorite character in Game of Thrones and why?
A Tyrion, because he's the wittiest. I like them all. Come on, I like Arya, Dany, and Sansa, and even, Theon and Victoria and the dolt. But, I have to love them to write about them. Some of them are flawed, and some of them are screwed up, and a lot of them are in trouble, but they're my kids. I once wrote a story called Portraits of His Children about a writer's relationship to his character, and they are my kids, probably the only ones I'm ever likely to have.
Là, le monsieur en bleu.
Hi. I had a question concerning people always accusing you of not loving your characters, contrary to what you just said before when you kill them off. And me and my friend here, we're musicians, and when we write music, we get emotionally implicated with what we do. When you kill off your characters, does it hit you? Does it disgust you? Does it make you sometimes want to cry?
Yeah. The Red Wedding was the hardest thing I ever wrote. I couldn't write it for a long time. I skipped over it when I reached that part of the book. I finished the entire book, and then I had to go back and make myself write that. But it was very, very difficult to write.
Autre question? Oui. On the left.
Hi, you may be a little bit shocked, but the first time I saw the series, I saw scenes from of Daenerys and another one of Caitlyn, and then I saw, oh, this must be a woman writing this, because I felt really you have this insight in these characters, especially women, and it's very precise. So I was just really amazed to see that it was a man writing. So thank you.
Well, thank you, I think, as a compliment. I definitely am a man. I can...
You don't have any ghostwriter?
No, I don't. I don't. But I do occasionally consult with women. I mean, number one, I know a lot of them, but and some things you don't have to consult. As I said earlier in answer to your question, I think the differences between men and women are small compared to the similarities. Our common humanity, the things that we all go through. The search for, as they say in Casablanca, it's all the same old story, a search for love and glory. And I think that's a lot of what we're all about. But there are experiences that I haven't had, and when I'm writing about one of those, I try to talk to people who have had that experience. When I first had Bran crippled by his fall from the tower, I had one fan who was paraplegic, and he and I exchanged a number of emails about, okay, what was it like to be paraplegic? Because I can try to imagine that, but I don't actually know that. When I wrote the scene where Sansa has her first period, this is an experience that I've also never had. But I talked to a number of women and said, well, what was it like when you had your first period? Was it scary? Was it nothing? Was it painful? Was it, tell me about it? And I got, like 16 different stories, and I found out it varied widely. When people who have actually been in combat I've talked to before the combat scenes, and that too varies widely, and that's sort of interesting. And of course, I've read a lot about that, but there are certain experiences that only women have had, at least in our society, and when I'm trying to tackle them, I try to consult with women, but I can definitely say that I am a man. But I'm glad you think I like writing women well. I certainly try, as I try with all of these characters.
Thank you. Now it's unfortunately the last question. So, where's the microphone? Yes, right here on the right.
Good afternoon. I think I speak for everyone here in this room when I say that it's really a pleasure to have you here in Neuchâtel. I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts regarding an upcoming movie of the Game of Thrones series. Do you feel like it's necessary? Because we all agree that the format of a TV show is more convenient if you want to tell stories rather than a 3-hour or 2-hour long movie.
This idea has been kicking around for a while. I've been asked about this, and somehow a misconception is getting out that I'm the one that's urging that we end the series with a movie. Let me make it clear that I'm not. I think it's a good idea, but it's not my idea. To end this with a series of big movies. The question that we face with the show is that the books continue to get bigger and bigger, and the show really can't get much bigger. We're the most expensive show on television, the most expensive on television show in the world right now, and we have the biggest cast, as far as I know, of any show on television. We can't keep adding characters and making the show more and more expensive. We're pushing up against the limits there. So we either have to make some cuts going forward and simplify the story, or we have to increase the format. And of course, one way to do that, one way to get a lot more money is to go with a motion picture budget rather than a television budget. A big fantasy motion picture like one of the Peter Dinklage things you have like $200 million for 3 hours, while one of our shows we have like $60 million for 10 hours. So there's a huge difference, and I happen to know, someone has told me, some source that I won't name, that there will be some major battles coming up and some dragon action and some stuff at the wall and White Walkers that looks to be kind of expensive. So How are we going to do that? I don't know. But one way to do that is with motion pictures, and I'm all in favor of the idea if we can get them financed. But I'm not saying that they're going to happen. Please don't misquote me here. I'm not saying that they're going to happen, and it's not my idea. It's just an idea that I've endorsed, let us say. And I'd love to see it, but I think the odds are probably against it. I'm probably not going to happen, but maybe, who knows? We're still, you know, one season at a time. Right now we're making season 5. They're finishing the scripts, they're going to start production, they're doing sites on that. So that's about all I can say about the movies. Was that the last question here? Okay,
Yes.
Let me say we're going to have a book signing now, and I'll be scrolling my illegible scroll in your books as you come up and come past. We have to keep the line moving fairly quickly. I can't do personal inscriptions or notes to your mother or anything like that in the books, because everybody would want one and we'd be here for 5 hours. And so I can just do straight inscription. But you can ask me questions as you come by, but you have to ask me questions quickly. So I have people in this situations like that who come up and they say, "Can I ask a question?" The answer to that is yes, but you just did.
Thank you very much.
So if you do have a question, I saw many hands here we didn't get to. When you get to me in the line and you have a question, you can just step up and say, "Who is Jon Snow's mother?" And then I'll say, then I'll whisper the answer. No, I won't whisper the answer. You won't know that, but yeah. And we're going to do it kind of row by row, right?
Yeah.
We're going to keep you up here, so don't everybody get up at once. Stay comfortable because it's going to take a while to get through it with you. Thank you.
George and Martin, thank you very much. Thank you.